Welcome to the Roetzel Health Law Hotspot. Health Law Hotspot is a podcast for physicians and health professionals that covers the legal issues and trends that affect the healthcare industry.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Health Law Hotspot. I'm Ericka Adler, shareholder at Roetzel and Ericka and leader of our healthcare practice. And today I'm joined by my very favorite guest, Christina Kuta, who is also a member of our health law practice. And today we're going to be talking about an area that Christina and I talk to a lot of clients about, which is concierge medicine. Many practices either have a concierge practice or are thinking of becoming a concierge practice. And what we want to talk about today are some of the things to think about in terms of how do you set it up properly? What are some of the legal issues to be aware of? And also, what are some of the insurance issues to be aware of? So why don't we start off by having Christina tell us a little bit about what a concierge practice is so that we're all using the same terminology.
Thanks, Ericka. So traditionally, a concierge practice is thought of a practice that doesn't necessarily take insurance, although there is an exception to that I'll talk about in a minute. But typically, it's a service where physicians sign up a limited number of patients, and those patients pay out of pocket for services. Generally, that means maybe an annual fee, and there'll be a whole list of services that are provided as part of that annual fee, or there may be a per service fee, depending on how it's structured. Now, there can be a hybrid component where a physician might still be accepting insurance, but charge a certain amount, maybe per year or per month, for services that otherwise are not covered by insurance. And we'll talk about some of that later today, but they may still accept insurance for services that otherwise would be covered services. And being part of a direct concierge practice generally affords patients more opportunity to interact with the physician and eliminate some of the concerns physicians may have with respect to insurance billing or other requirements they have to meet in order to properly bill and be reimbursed for services.
Okay, so just to visualize for those people to make sure we're all on the same page, there's the type of concierge practice where you might pay $10,000 a year and they will see you when you need to be seen and they will take care of you, etc. Everything's included for the 10,000. Now, typically, you might still carry insurance because if you have a catastrophic accident or something like that, you're still going to go to the hospital. But it's one flat fee and everything's included. And that type of practice is not billing insurance, accepting insurance, or anything like that.
It doesn't allow you to bill insurance as well for
Correct.
any of the services that otherwise would be covered.
And that gets this, really spelled out very clearly from day one. The second part would be a practice that you go to and you may still use your insurance. In fact, and we're going to talk about this next, this is the most common way that practices start to kind of convert to a concierge practice. They still get insurance, but they charge a little extra for certain things that are non-covered services. And as you mentioned, we're going to talk about that in a little bit of detail. But the difference is that one takes insurance, one doesn't, and one will provide any kind of service you need, but you and they cannot bill insurance whatsoever. So just to kind of give people a very clear example of the two kinds. So why don't we talk then about a little bit more detail about what you and I are seeing in terms of practices who want to kind of dip their toe, so to speak, into concierge. How do they do it? And, what do they need to think about?
So there are a lot of considerations that need to be decided up front. One of the biggest is, will that practice still accept insurance for certain covered services and only charge a fee for services that are not covered by the insurance? And then that gets into an issue of what is truly covered by and not covered by the insurance. There's actually been some court cases and challenges by the federal government under Medicare and by particular insurance providers, some of the large national insurance providers, that when a physician is charging for a supposed non-covered service, it really is considered a covered service. So when you're going to have a model where you are still enrolled as an insurance provider, as a physician, and you're still taking insurance for covered services, you have to really consider what may be allowed to be charged for. And, over the years, we've worked with a lot of providers sort of deciding what may be okay to charge, what may not be okay to charge. And, typically, if you want to give access to a private email or phone directly to the physician, 24/7 access or access, within limited time periods, phone consultations or telehealth consultations that would not otherwise be covered. As you may know, there are a lot of insurance providers now that will pay for telehealth services, but they have to be under strict parameters. So a doctor might want to charge somebody for telehealth consultations that are separate from what otherwise would be reimbursable. Coordination of care with patients and other healthcare providers, doing like an overall health evaluation and sort of a wellness plan, not like an annual physical, because that will be covered, but something above and beyond that, that talks about not just maybe medical issues, but psychosocial issues, diet, things like that, can be things that could be carved out from what's insurance covered. Making house calls. We have physicians that do that as part of their concierge practice. They charge for that separately because in many instances, insurance will not pay for those services. Also, maybe having non-business hour appointments. People can pay a fee and then they may have access to appointments from the physician prior to business hours and after business hours, or maybe on weekends when the physician might not otherwise be open.
Right.
There certainly are things that we know likely probably aren't okay. And this is given from case law and some of the guidance we've seen from Medicare and other providers. Payments for administrative services. There was a time when concierge was early in its process, and a lot of doctors were charging to fill out forms or to refill prescriptions. These are things generally considered as part of the covered service from the service code that the insurer is paying for. So likely not okay to charge extra for that. Although there may be some circumstances where it might be okay, generally it's not overall. Payments for extra time during appointments. Most insurers and Medicare say you provide the amount of time you need to evaluate the patient and assess the patient correctly. So saying I'm going to give you an extra 20 minutes probably isn't something you can pay for. And also payment for priority appointments. There has been some discussion that some of the insurance policies will say you can't give our covered patients appointment times that aren't as favorable as you're giving people that maybe are paying for that service. So those are kind of things that you want to consider, and also look at your insurance documents, your provider documents, to determine what may be in those documents that are required for you to provide to your insured patient that you couldn't otherwise charge for.
Right. And you and I have seen over the years how this has changed. We've seen private waiting rooms with, food and catering in it. We've seen premier parking spots. I've seen ones where the doctor will come to the emergency room and just meet you there just to help you if something was to happen. Will see family members who might be on vacation and not have a physician nearby. So we've seen a really wide variety. And over time, because what is covered and not covered changes, it's really important that if you're doing that kind of concierge practice, that you regularly review what you're covering and what you're not. Some of our doctors have offered testing in their office that for, certain type of testing that would have been considered non-covered at one point, but now is covered, maybe DEXA scans at one point and things like that. And it's now covered. So really important in terms of, not getting in trouble is to kind of do an annual review. And Christine, I don't know if you remember, but we used to have people who would get to be signed up for the emails of the doctor, where the doctors might put together a little summary of what was going on in the practice.
Exactly.
Nobody wants that now, because now there's web pages and all that information is out there. So it's really as a sign of the times. Some of the stuff is super outdated now. So really important is, what are you charging for when you charge this concierge fee? Some people call it a club fee, right? And if you set this up a few years ago and you haven't talked to your lawyer since then, I do urge you to talk to them, because what you did a few years ago and what you're doing now may no longer be legal. So you got to
Yeah,
check.
and I think one of the biggest examples of that is the annual physical or annual wellness exam. For a long time, Medicare was not covering that service, and insurance companies were not obligated to cover it. Now they are. So if you started a concierge practice many years ago and you've just kind of rested on the documents you've always had and the services you always provided for a fee, if you're charging for what Medicare considers an annual wellness visit or what an insurer is required to pay for as an annual wellness visit, that's problematic. That's not something that today you actually can charge for separately.
Absolutely. So let's say we're going to set up one of these kinds of practices, either flat fee, all services covered, or we still take insurance and we're just charging you for these extras. What does a practice need to do to get started engaging in that kind of practice?
Sure. So a couple of issues. If you're going to have no insurance at all, then you need to make sure that you're no longer a party to any insurance agreements if you were currently a party. Those need to be appropriately terminated pursuant to whatever terms of the provider agreement is for that particular insurer. If you're going to have a hybrid approach where you will still accept some insurance, then you need to carefully review those documents and related policies to determine what you are supposed to charge for and things that you may be able to charge for separate from that. Another big issue is Medicare. So if you have a concierge practice and you're not going to accept any insurance or bill any insurance, and you want to treat Medicare patients, you have to do it very carefully. You have to formally opt out as a Medicare provider. This is if you're currently enrolled as a participating Medicare provider that's accepting Medicare rates, or if you're enrolled and you're not considered a participating provider and you're able to charge a varying rate. And there actually is a federal law, although there's a difference of opinion on this. Most people interpret it to mean even if you've never enrolled in Medicare, you're technically still required to bill Medicare for patients who come to you have Medicare, although if you're not enrolled, it's tricky how you do that, but you should even opt out formally in Medicare. And how you do that is there's a particular form you need to fill out that has to have certain information in it that your Medicare contractor can inform you, or legal counsel who does this routinely can inform you. You turn it in. It used to be that you had to renew it every 2 years. That's no longer a requirement. But you have to have a specific written agreement with Medicare patients with very specific statutory language that requires them to understand exactly that they cannot bill Medicare themselves. They can't submit a claim. You won't submit a claim. And that has to be updated and renewed, signed by you and the patient, and provided to the patient in writing every 2 years. So apart from the regular agreements that you want to clearly establish with your concierge patients that state exactly what will be required, how much they'll pay, what service will be provided, if refunds will be given under any circumstances, if somebody wants to terminate during an annual year where they paid a fee, heaven forbid somebody passes away, what would need to happen as far as getting a refund. Those are all things to consider in your agreements. But with Medicare patients, there are these extra steps that must be done. Otherwise, you will be violating Medicare regulations.
Okay, so let me just ask this question. What if somebody is not working full time in a concierge practice? So they're working somewhere else where they do, provide services to Medicare patients or Blue Cross Blue Shield or whatever it is. And then they're also working in a concierge practice. Does that create any issue?
It can get very tricky too, particularly when you're working with the insurance companies. So let's say a physician has a practice where he or she's actively working and is a provider under a lot of the major insurance companies. And they want to start a side practice, which is going to be concierge, which will not accept any insurance products. The issue becomes when the patients who are maybe seen in both places may not understand that one is covered and one isn't covered. Also, we've had instances where the insurer has gone back to the physician and say, well, you can't be out of our network and not a provider for us at all in one practice, but you're a provider for us in another practice. There have been issues where, doctors have gotten payments for services provided in the concierge practice when they never billed for that. Maybe the patient turned it in for reimbursement and the doctor was paid as an in-network provider because the records for that insurance company show that doctor as attached to the first practice, which is an enrolled and participating provider. So it really can get tricky if a doctor is going to be involved in two practices, one totally not enrolled in insurance and one that is enrolled in insurance.
Right. We've seen that happen many times. So if you're going to start a practice, you need to think about all of these things. Or if you're going to convert your practice, you need to think about these things. And then, of course, you need to make sure you have the right documentation. And so, of course, in addition to what Christina has described, when you have a practice, you're starting one or you're doing your annual checkup to make sure you have everything in place, you do want to make sure you're getting all the right documents signed, whether it is a patient authorization form or some other type of form. Is there anything specific that we need to think about for a concierge practice that an ordinary practice would not be having filled out? I mean, obviously they might have their participation agreement,
Sure.
for being part of a concierge practice, but otherwise is the paperwork fairly similar?
Paperwork is fairly similar. Generally, one of the things that the concierge physician would want to have in a paperwork from a patient that other physicians who practice more insurance directed might want is to clearly state out what's required as far as payment, when payments made, again, issues on returning payments if there's something happens during the annual service year, and then also make it very clear what services are covered. I can't state that enough because, there have been issues where doctors have had problems with patients because it wasn't clear. It was very vague as to what was going to be covered under an annual fee. And the patient obviously thought more services were going to be covered. And the physician thought, no, there's less services that are going to be covered. And that meeting of the minds is really important, particularly when you're starting a concierge practice. You want to keep patients happy and you want good reviews. And if you have patients that are angry because they feel like they're not getting the benefit of what they paid for, but it was just a miscommunication, that can lead to poor reviews and issues that could be eliminated at the beginning.
Right.
Some other things to consider from a perspective of concierge practices, how many patients a physician can reasonably enter into agreements with for concierge services. Understanding that traditionally in these practices, physicians are offering more time and generally additional services that take up time that they wouldn't offer in a more traditional insurance directed practice. So you have to carefully consider what number of patients does the physician need to cover costs and make a living, and also how many patients can he or she reasonably enter into this practice and still be able to make a commitment to all of them for all the different things that they have agreed to as part of the annual fee and as part of the service. And one other thing to keep in mind is, and you and I did a podcast on this just a little bit ago, there's the new commonly referred to as the No Surprises Act that started in January 1st of this year. The No Surprises Act requires practices to provide what we call good faith estimates related to services that are being provided for patients that have no insurance or choosing not to use their insurance. And one of the things that has come up recently is, do concierge practices fall within this law? And without any further guidance or discussion from regulators, we do believe they fall under the law because they're providing a service to someone who doesn't have insurance or will not be using their insurance. And because of that, they must comply with providing a good faith estimate with certain requirements in the estimate, has to be provided in a certain time period. Notice must be made at the office and on the website in a searchable format that specifically states that the patient has a right to a good faith notice, and a few other statutorily required language. So I would certainly encourage anyone to look at that prior podcast or any of our client alerts that have discussed this to sort of familiarize yourself with that law and understand that you aren't exempt just because you have a practice that is not accepting any insurance.
Right. And for a concierge practice that just charges a flat fee for the whole year, that is going to be a pretty simple task, right? Because you know exactly what you're charging. It's not an estimate, right?
Correct.
But for a practice that charges a monthly or quarterly or whatever it is concierge fee, and then also provides particular services from time to time, that's a little bit more of a complex task to, really comply. So definitely, and we can answer any questions. One other thing I want to mention is that patient disputes do happen. And so in all of your documents, whether it's, just your financial agreement with the patient or the concierge agreement that you might sign up with the patient, you might want to consider including language in there that talks about how disputes are going to be resolved. Maybe the parties will agree to mediate or agree to go through arbitration, which has really become super popular in healthcare just because it can be faster, less expensive, private, et cetera. So just something we've learned over the past few years is that having it spelled out how the parties will resolve disputes can be a great thing to include in those type of documents. So just wanted to kind of mention that. All right, so what other information do we want to talk about when it comes to concierge practices? What are some of the bumps in the roads that people need to be aware of that you're not going to really know about as you head into this?
Yeah, I think some of the biggest hurdles when you're starting off this type of practice is, again, getting and achieving a reasonable number of patients and understanding sort of how far you can be stretched as a physician and still manage to provide all the services that are being requested as part of the concierge service. I think the other issue is making sure you have appropriately crafted documents that can really help make sure you have no or minimizing concerns with patients down the road as far as misunderstandings or the disputes that you mentioned. Making sure you've completed all necessary paperwork related to any prior insurers you may have been part of that you're no longer going to be participating provider with, obviously keeping the Medicare requirements in mind. And, I think too, a little bit of this is how much your interactions with patients may change. You have patients now that you may ask to be part of your concierge practice, which is likely the case. And it will take time to sort of see how active those patients want to be. Is a patient only still seeing you a couple times a year, just like when they had insurance paying for this? Or do you have patients now that think, great, I can call my doctor twice a day, 7 days a week, because I now have this great concierge opportunity and plan? So there's really things to think about there. And then making sure you learn from them and you have the ability to sort of change your model, change your process, and change the agreements over time when you see what really is going to work for you and serve you best. Because you've seen what isn't going to work. It's certainly something that is new and challenging, but it is becoming more of a trend. I think physicians are really burdened by a lot of the requirements of insurance and billing procedures and Medicare regulations, Medicaid regulations. There's a lot they have to put into that isn't just the practice of medicine. And many physicians, I know the ones we work with, are very happy. I don't know of anyone who's really left a concierge practice and gone back to a more traditional insurance-directed practice. They have time to spend with their patients and really focus on the practice of medicine, which is why they went to medical school in the first place.
Right. And I think the true concierge practice is appealing for that reason. The administrative burdens that are on doctors can be lifted away by those type of concierge practices, which obviously works for certain types of patients, right? As you mentioned, the very, very sick patients, the patients with chronic conditions or, very special, medical needs. Those are very unique concierge practices that will work for them. But the whole idea is to kind of simplify the doctor's life. On the other hand, if you're doing a hybrid concierge practice, you have a traditional practice, plus on top of it, you've kind of added this extra burden of running a concierge practice. So you're not really relieving yourself of all of those obligations and you're taking on more. So the reason for doing that really is to maybe get a little bit of extra time and attention to your patients, maybe make a little bit of extra money to kind of make up for, some of the burdens of your normal everyday practice. So there are reasons to do both. There are doctors doing both that are very happy. There are doctors that have tried at least the hybrid approach that have found it didn't work for them. So really, I agree with you, though. Anybody who's gone full concierge has stayed full concierge. And I do think we'll see it as a growing part of the medical environment going forward. Unfortunately, a lot of patients can't afford that kind of care, right? And it really is for people who have extra money to spend on that. But it certainly is a growing area. I know where I live, I see these type of concierge practices popping up everywhere. And there are some national organizations that are running these kind of practices, and I expect that it'll be a growing trend going forward. So any final words?
I would echo everything you said about this being a growing trend. Year over year, concierge practices have increased, and I see them continuing to increase for these very reasons. Many physicians are finding them positive, and patients are finding they have positive experiences as well in this model.
Right. Well, I guess, if anybody has any questions about setting up a concierge practice, acquiring a concierge practice, setting up a hybrid concierge practice, if you're not sure you're doing it right and you already have a concierge practice, or if you just need a checkup on your practice, then you should feel free to reach out to myself or Christina. We're happy to answer any questions. You can call us or email us, and we're happy to talk about this area. We're really interested in concierge medicine, and I think it's something that many doctors should and will continue to explore. Any final words, or you think we've wrapped it up now?
I think we've wrapped it up, but we're certainly happy to help in any way. And particularly if you're doing this model now and something we've said here has triggered something to think, maybe we're not doing it right, or maybe we're not keeping up with the rules as they change, let us know, give us a call. We'll run through it with you and make sure everything is compliant.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us at the Health Law Hotspot. I'm Ericka Adler. This is Christina Kuta, who are both part of our health law practice at Roetzel and Andrus. You can see our other podcasts at ralaw.com, or just Google Health Law Hotspot and you'll find our YouTube page. We will be back next time with another topic, and thanks for joining us.
The Roetzel Health Law Hotspot is made available by the firm and its attorneys for educational purposes and to provide general information, not to provide specific legal advice. Use of the Roetzel Health Law Hotspot does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and the firm or any of its attorneys. The Roetzel Health Law Hotspot should not be used as a substitute for competent legal advice, and you should contact an attorney in your state about any legal needs or questions you may have.